Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Donnelly, Director of Webinars for Tech Channel, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation, Protecting Power Systems from Ransomware, How and Why. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but feel free to ask a question or submit a comment at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel to alert us, and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of today's slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources. You'll find that on the left side of your screen, and note that you can download those right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Fortra. Our featured speaker today is Sandi Moore, Principal Security Consultant at Fortra. Sandi's been working with Fortra customers for over 20 years, supporting systems monitoring and systems software. With experience on IBM I, AIX, and Linux, she's been involved in product demonstrations, implementation, support, training, research, and product testing. Sandi is also a certified professional forensics analyst and a certified data privacy practitioner. And with that, Sandi, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Janine. Really appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us today. I appreciate the introduction there. I'm definitely love IBM platform and have been embracing this security on IBM for my career, and I just really hope that you'll get something out of it today. As mentioned, we're Fortra. We are your cybersecurity ally. We bring the same people-first support and best-in-class portfolio that you've come to expect from help systems over the years, but now we're unified through our mission of providing solutions to organizations' cybersecurity problems. We are a global company, but we're still based with our headquarters just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, offices located across the globe and the United States for sales, support, development, and making sure that we have that global perspective on cybersecurity. We offer flexible IT software solutions, and this is going to include our infrastructure protection suite, data security suite, threat intelligence and research, as well as automation solutions, and across all platforms. But today my focus is really going to be on IBM I, and that's where I've spent my career. It's definitely something I'm passionate about. We are so passionate about security. We've actually been doing our State of IBM I security study for 20 years. And the reason we know that security is still a hot topic and something that needs to be addressed is with our security study, we've found over the years that there's always room for improvement. Security is a moving target. It is a constant change. You're constantly having to add new layers of security and addressing the threats as they evolve as well. Our security study is based on our security scan tool, and it compiles this study of the security statistics that we collect during with those security scan tools. And the study, which is available online, gives you a picture of what these IBM I shops are currently doing with their security controls. Sometimes it's not a lot, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But before we really jump into talking about the security on IBM I and our primary topic today with the ransomware threats and IBM I think I want to actually kick this off with a poll. And what we're looking for is kind of to understand how you're protecting your IBM I from ransomware, and really getting an idea of what you perceive the threat to be, how you've approached it. There's definitely been some debates over whether or not this should be considered as part of the problem, and we'll definitely talk about that as well. Really kind of just getting an idea here, if you are relying on Windows-based tools to protect your systems, if you're actually have addressed it specifically for the IBMI and have solutions built for that, or you might not actually know what is being done for that. Maybe you're just kind of starting to dip your toes into this realm and aren't sure. And then maybe you didn't realize that you needed to specifically protect your IBMI from ransomware. So it's definitely a conversation that comes up quite a bit. Yeah. So what do we think here?
Well, Sandi, I think there we go. I wanted to wait for that next update. I'm going to go ahead and launch these results to the audience.
Awesome. All right. So it looks like it's kind of split here pretty even between the Windows-based anti-ransomware tools and solutions built for IBMI. A couple folks are not sure. And I'm really glad to hear that nobody didn't realize that they needed to protect their IBMI. So that's reassuring that there's at least that awareness. So, and probably why you're here today. All right. So I think we'll jump back onto our slides now. All right. You know, the webinar today, we talking about how and why, and I think that we really need to start with the why we need to protect our power servers from ransomware. And this is really where, figuring out what those threats are and where they're coming from. The concerns, of course, are the threat sources, and those are going to be a variety. And the threat sources to the IBMI are the same as to every other platform in your entire environment. For every company, every entity is going to fall under this same threat. Sometimes the threats are higher based on your type of business or who you do business with. There's a lot of different focuses that these threat actors are going to go after, whether it's the black hat hackers that are intentional attacks to prove a point, to show that they can, to try to teach you a lesson for not being as secure as you should be. Insider threats, sometimes it's the disgruntled employee, sometimes it's the employee who's been compromised, they've got potential, gambling problem, maybe they have financial issues and they are willing to compromise their principals and provide an inside avenue into data. And then the all-encompassing ransomware as a service, which has made ransomware attacks way too available for threat actors and provides them with easy access to be able to attack on a very large scale. Now, when we look at the breaches across the U.S., January 2002 through September of 2023, so just a year ago, there were over 10 billion impacted individuals. And this data comes from privacyrights.org. Over 35,000 breaches reported, and the unique data breaches were over 17,000. So there are plenty of breaches to talk about, and it unfortunately is not ending anytime soon. In the last year, I actually ran through looking at the breaches in the last 12 months, and I was really disheartened to see that we're actually, unfortunately, with some of the bigger ones, that National Public Data at AT&T, that it is going to add another almost billion records impacted in data breaches. So it's big business. It's going to continue to happen. Why is that? It's because data is valuable. It is a valuable commodity. It is more valuable than any other source for most organizations. And this data is compromised through a multitude of avenues. It could be data theft, where they want to steal that data and use it for some other purpose, whether it's competition, if it's another country, it could be a nation state that is trying to get a hold of information. It could be that they are trying to hold it for ransom. Very common, that ransomware threat, and whether they are going to hold that data for ransom and give it back to you, or they are threatening the extortion side of it, where they're going to expose the data if you don't give them the ransom. And sometimes it's actually just comes down to data destruction. And so anyone and anything is a target. it doesn't matter what business you are in, you are a potential target for these threat actors, and they are going to go after this data one way or another. And we really need to do is start thinking about what those threats are, where they're coming from, and where is our data? Where is that valuable information? One of the things that I find is that there's a general assumption that power systems aren't going to be impacted by these threats to the data. And unfortunately, it is a very clear and present threat. The IBMI is just another server. It is typically the core server for the business. It has the most valuable data. However, we have seen time and time again that these systems are in fact vulnerable. They can be attacked by ransomware. This is an example of a customer who actually had a ransomware attack. They had a share over their IFS and they were hit. Thankfully for them, they actually had some controls in place that detected the attack, blocked the attack, and then found the malware that was dropped during that attack to further infiltrate their environment. It happens, though, more and more, and it is not an isolated event, unfortunately. We see these attacks continue to happen, whether it's the development system that we saw impacted by the Niton ransomware attack with 400,000 files encrypted. It could be the customer with the 500,000 files encrypted and 228,000 copies of that ransomware dropped onto their system. There is, it continues to be a threat. I just talked to somebody a couple of weeks ago. Their sister company got hit by a ransomware attack, and their IBMI was completely down, fully impacted. We're going to talk a lot more about this as we go through the presentation, but this is definitely where having your core server impacted is not good. So one of the things we need to think about is how is the IBMI involved in these threats and how is it impacted? How does this actually happen? One of the concerns is that IBMI itself can act as the source of a malware problems on the network. So because there's this perception that the IBMI is impervious to these types of threats, we don't pay a lot of attention to it from the perspective of malware. So it acts as a very happy host to malware. I don't know if you guys recognize that photo there, but that's Mary Milan. That's Typhoid Mary. Not unlike the IBMI, it is a carrier for this threat that where it will display no symptoms of having this malware. So like Typhoid Mary carried typhoid fever and never exhibited any symptoms. And so she was able to pass it along without ever anybody realizing it. They finally put two and two together. Same thing with IBMI. This is where that source of malware can come. Files are populated in the IFS through a lot of different methods. And when that happens, you're not actually validating that those files in that IFS are not infected. They can sit on that system and be a source of malware outbreaks inside your network. The way this can happen is through those shared IFS directories. That is probably your biggest exposure, is having shares where it is going to happily host it out, allowing mapped drives. You've got immediate direct contact with PCs, which are unfortunately the biggest problem for ransomware, viruses, any malware spreading. FTP will happily send files up and down from the system without looking to see what the contents are. Any NFS mounts, backups, high availability. When it comes to high availability, I like to remind folks that your high availability system will replicate anything, whether it is a good file change or a bad file change. So you have to keep that in mind. If you have replicated viruses or malware or encrypted files from a ransomware attack replicating over to your HA system, when you discover you've got a problem, you roll over to HA, guess what? You've got the same problem over there. So really what it needs to be taking is a new approach, a new look at how you're going to protect the system from these types of the threats and not relying on the wrong methods to protect the servers. You know, there's always antivirus, malware, anti-malware, protections that are put into place other places within your environment. Your PCs are protected. Your Windows servers are protected. You've got mail server protection. You've got your firewall. All of those things are deployed, but they can still reach that power server if it's one user, and it only takes one user. And I like to remind people of that. It's not just, you know, oh, everybody's going to suddenly not have protection in place. It's one person, and it's usually one person who has entirely too much access to your server that ends up being the problem. They disable their protection on their PC. Now they've become a victim. If the updates fail, if in some attacks they actually deactivate and block the scanning from happening on those local workstations, so you are not going to have that protection there, and then it spreads. And then zero-day exploits. New threats that aren't detected make their way into your environment, and because the IBMI is not typically looked at from this perspective, it can sit there on the server for basically all time. All right, so lots of ways this can happen, and this is really where you have to start thinking about how are we going to change this and how are we going to protect our power servers from these threats. These threats are not going away, and so we really need to start developing a strategy for protecting better and taking that holistic approach. I like to think of it, and there's 3 steps that I'm going to share with you guys today. First one is system configuration. This is really about that low-hanging fruit, the things that you can make immediate changes to on your system that is going to have a big impact in protecting the system from these types of threats. Now, we always wonder, you know, IBMI has that reputation for being a very secure operating system on the market. It is. It has some great functionality built into it, but I always say it is securable. There is some assembly required. The platform itself is not secure by default. We have to take steps to use best practices to actually use the capabilities of the system to make the system more secure. And this is where you can do some changes. So system configuration, there's a short list here of things that are going to have some pretty big impact on your ability to protect the system better. First and foremost, stay current on your OS levels and patches. There actually have been a number of CVEs. I actually just watched a certain video channel. There was a hacking published for IBMI. There were a number of CVEs that were published because of what this group found. And I think that highlights that the IBMI is not immune. It has attention. The threat actors know it's there, and they're just going to take their sweet time to get to these systems. So we have to make sure that we are maintaining those OS levels and patches so that you are using the most current available that IBM is giving you. There's a lot of controls built into the system that you can implement. There is auditing you can include. There are object level authorities that you can implement. So making sure that your shared directories are not public change or public all authority. Making sure that your shares are not read-write, but setting them to read-only shares. Strengthening your user profile security. So IBMI profiles are typically well over authorized than what they typically need. So having users with all object authority and maybe even IOSys config authority to start services on the system that they don't need to have access to. And so pulling back those authorities to those users. implementing IBM's built-in intrusion detection system, and there is an option there. It is going to give you some good information as to how intrusion attempts are happening and allow you to have visibility to this activity. Using this to be able to pull things back and actually provide some controls from within. Second strategy here is virus protection. So native virus scanning and ransomware protection is going to ensure that the system itself is going to be protected from the inside. Using non-native protection is unfortunately creates a bigger exposure because it is going to require you to create shares over your integrated file system that are going to be well beyond what is a safe method. So sharing that IFS and then using a non-native tool, you're going to be actually trying to scan across the network, exposing that. You'll need a profile that has significant authority on the system. And then the system isn't going to understand what those responses are. So using native virus protection ensures that the IFS isn't going to be acting as that host. So you're not going to have malware that's actually going out and being picked up by your end users who are using those files, or if you're sending IFS files out to customers or vendors or third-party providers, you don't want to actually have that malware hosted out. IBM actually includes some controls that allow for this native virus scanning. They have exit programs, they have system values, and they have attributes on those IFS stream files that actually support that native virus scanning. The piece they didn't do was provide you with a scan engine to do that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that again too. The other side of it is using exit programs that can actually monitor those malicious access patterns that are typical of a ransomware attack and stop the attack. So this is really about reducing the damage in the blast zone to the IFS, which, by the way, I haven't mentioned it yet, your integrated file system or IFS, if you look at that root directory, qsys.lib is there. It is part of the IFS, your operating system. And when we talk about ransomware attacks and what can be affected by a ransomware attack, if you have that really bad practice of sharing your root directory with a read-write share, and you can have the entire system clobbered in those ransomware attacks. So that's where we've seen the most recent threat I had a customer with a couple weeks ago was they had that root share and their operating system was impacted. So that native qsys.lib file structure was encrypted by that ransomware attack. So making sure that you have something in place that is going to be able to monitor and stop those attacks is going to ensure that the IBMI is in fact stable and available and not compromised in those attacks. My third piece that can provide you with some pretty good ransomware protection is using exit programs. And these are really about giving you the ability to have visibility and auditing of what is happening and coming through the system from the PC interfaces, and then giving you the ability to add some control. Now, when you think of IBMI, you probably think green screen. Okay, great. Green screen is really easy to secure. You've got an application menu where you give users only what you want to have them to give them access to. You've got command line access you can restrict. And then you're going to have maybe some application web interface or GUI interface. And so it's still really restricted and providing your users only the visibility to the system that you want them to have. However, there's a whole host of interfaces that allow users to bypass those controls. And those are going to include your file server, FTP server, DDM, ODBC, all of these different types of interfaces by default don't have any visibility. There's no auditing, so you can't actually see who's using them. We assume we know who's using those interfaces, but you really don't have that visibility, and you can't build in controls. Not every user that is given access to the system needs to have access to FTP, for example, or the file server. Those shares that are available, great, but how do you control how a specific user and who is going to be able to use each of those specific interfaces? And that's where the exit programs come in. They act as your firewall for the IBMI, where you can pick and choose, outside of the green screen, which interfaces are available to which users, and then be able to fine-tune how they're going to be able to access it. Think of your IBMI as your building. Green screen's your front door. All of these interfaces are the side door. You've got a security camera over the green screen door. You've got the key that the users have to get in, their user ID and password. All of those other interfaces don't have a security camera above the door. The user has their user ID and password, or the threat actor, the other person, has their user ID and password. So making sure that they don't have free access without the security camera seeing they're coming and going and what they're doing is really critical to being able to stop these types of threats from impacting the system. Now, threat actors are very often inside of an environment for a very long time before they actually launch an attack. So they are seeing the traffic that is on your network. What servers are the majority of your users going to? What is the traffic directed to? It's going to be to that IBMI. So they're going to start looking for that valuable information. They're going to start looking for that server, that core server, the crown jewels for the environment. So making sure that you don't have a way for them to circumvent your controls and take advantage of that easy access to the system is where those exit programs come in. So not only the visibility, but the control that you can add on. Now, the reason I know that all of these methods are going to be helpful is that when we look at our State of IBMI Security Study data, we see that profiles have entirely too much authority. An average system that we evaluated last year had 241 root profiles, so that all object authority, where you can delete the operating system. You couple a ransomware attack with an all object profile, you've got a system that is extremely compromised. 16% of the systems we looked at did not actually meet the minimum security level for the system. So security level 40, the standard that IBM ships with, is actually being back leveled when people are upgrading. Always a concern there. And when we look at those exit programs and what's happening with monitoring, FTP, ODBC, SQL, file server, those alternative ways to get to the system, we only saw 40% of the systems were actually looking at it. Now, whether they had full coverage or not, that's also another question. Having exit programs, I will tell everybody I talk to, is not enough. It has to be configured correctly to actually protect your system from those types of threats. 41% of the systems we looked at last year had server-level malware protection. Not enough. We need to start seeing more native protection for these servers. They are, again, the crown jewels, the most important data, which is the valuable asset of the company, is that data. So we have to make sure that we are protecting those servers themselves. There's even some regulatory compliance mandates that say you have to have malware protection on the server. And that's another conversation, but keep that in mind. It may even be your cyber insurance policy that may dictate that you have that server level malware protection. If you don't, if you have a claim against that cyber insurance policy, they may or may not actually cover you because you did not meet each of those line items. They don't want to pay out. They're expecting you to do everything you can to protect it. And if all of those measures fail, then they're going to come in and pay out on those claims. So you have to really think about, not only are we concerned about our data, but what about those other impacts that it can have? The financial impact can be huge. All right, so I promised you guys that I have those 3 different things: the system configuration, the virus protection, the exit programs. Another strategy, though, I thought I would throw out here as kind of bonus content, and is the detection of these anomalies, the security threats, the things that are happening on the system. Is it's not enough to protect the system. You really need to make sure that you are watching what's happening so that you can react quickly. Because in these attacks, if you do not react quickly enough, it's going to spread faster and wider, and the recovery is going to take even longer. So you want to make sure you're monitoring recorded data. Something I briefly mentioned when we were talking about system configuration is auditing. Making sure you're auditing changes to objects on the system, changes to the IFS objects, changes to your profiles, all of those things. And make sure that you're actually looking at that recorded data. You need to actually watch that. Those invalid sign-in attempts, watching for those, making sure that somebody is actually paying attention to it, alerting when these incidents happen. Not knowing when they happen, you can't react fast enough. So if you do have those controls implemented on the system that I've suggested, you need to make sure that all of the security team, not just the IBMI team, is aware of what's happened, because the faster you're going to react, the less impact there's going to be. There's going to be, if you have an attack that has impacted your IBMI, there's a compromised workstation somewhere. There's a compromised server, a Windows server, most likely somewhere. It can even be Linux. Linux has had a lot of threats, and they are actually becoming more prevalent. No platform is immune, so we need to make sure that we're collecting all of this data centrally. And using a SIM solution is a great way to do that, where you've got that full picture of everything that's happening. And then the other piece for detection is making sure that you have that backup and recovery plan. Now, I kind of made it sound like the high availability and that recovery plan is not going to really help you in these attacks, but having some good, well-established plans and processes in place can help that recovery process. High availability is going to be not going to be as helpful as we would like in the event of an attack like this, but having that plan in place for what to do in the event of this is going to be really important. So do your replication, do a backup of your HA system. Use that as your gold standard for recovery, not having that online HA system as the only method. So recovering from these attacks is very different than a hardware failure or a software failure. This needs to be well-defined, and you need to practice too. Make sure that you have actually gone through this recovery plan. Everybody knows what their part is and what they're going to do when this happens. You notice I said when this happens? I really strongly feel that every company, it's not if you're going to be attacked by ransomware, it's when it's going to happen and how bad is it going to be. We are all vulnerable, and so it needs to be taken seriously, and you need to really think about what is going to happen? What are we going to do? How are we going to recover from it? Better yet, how are we going to prevent a lot of this from happening? All right, so lots of things to think about here as far as strategies and how we're going to protect better from these ransomware threats, malware threats that are out there in the wild. Want to actually throw out another poll here for you guys. And really looking at how your organization is prioritizing these defense strategies for IBMI. So I asked if you guys were doing anything with it, but really, how is it prioritized? Is it at the top of the conversation? Have they explicitly called out the IBMI as the system? And really just making sure that it is part of that conversation. If you're not included in these conversations, you should be. Sometimes there's this full strategy that's in place. Sometimes it is yeah, we know we should look at it, but we just really haven't had time to work on it. We've got minimal staff that knows the IBMI. We haven't been able to really circle the wagons on this. And you may not know if there is, in fact, any prioritizing of the IBMI with the defenses. I'm sure that there's conversations going on at a higher level about the threats that are out there. I think maybe sometimes we need to speak up and add our voices to those conversations and ensure that we are including the system in that. Now, I think of the IBMI, this is our, your core server, and we're looking at everything but it. So we're blind to what's happening there. All right, looks like we got some good results there, Janine.
Okay, I'll go ahead and launch these. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, so looks like it's pretty split again there on having a comprehensive strategy. Others know it's an issue, but they just haven't been able to get to it. And then some others that are not sure. Thankfully, again, we don't have anybody thinking the IBMI is not at risk. So that's good. I think that maybe my message is getting out there. And I'm not the only one that is shouting this from the top of the hills. We need this to be taken seriously. All right. I'm glad that there is that thought process is there. Obviously, I'm with Fortra. We have what we are bringing to the table for you is our best-of-breed PowerTech security solutions. We have been in this business for almost 40 years, and our commitment to security is paramount. We have put so much focus into this. And so we've got the tools that are going to be able to give you guys the ability to implement some of these strategies that I was talking about. A whole suite of tools that are going to give you different methods of protecting the system. So what I'm really focusing on today, obviously, is our native virus protection. So PowerTech Antivirus was actually brought to market based on a request from IBM. They approached a company I've worked for 21 years ago, asked us to help them build the tool. They created that infrastructure I talked about earlier with the exit programs, the system values, and the attributes for stream files to allow for that native virus scanning. What we bring to the table is the only native commercially backed solution, where you're going to be able to scan those files on the IFS and ensure that they are not infected. We do on-access scanning, so as users are using the file server, whether it's a mapped drive or they're simply using the integrated file system utility in ACS, we're going to ensure that the malware is not spreading out to those users directly to those PCs. You're going to be able to do batch scanning. So on-demand scheduled scans, scanning the entire IFS, because hopefully you are not sharing that root directory. You've limited the access to the IFS through the file server, through any shares. We still need to scan those systems because any system is going to be using the IFS. You can't get away from it, and malware has a way of making its way into those directories. I've seen web servers with infected files. We had one where there was a Trojan horse program that was actually redirecting ad traffic. It had been sitting on that system for 9 years. Gentleman says, but it's old. And I said, yeah, it's still working because you haven't neutralized it. You didn't scan, you didn't find it. So it's still there, still working. It happens time and time again. Third party, we had years back, we had a update that came from a software vendor, and they had an infected file that shipped with their product. If you have any graphical representation of your IBMI, including ACS, you are using the IFS. So making sure that these infections are not on the system. This is a way for them to infiltrate an environment, planting it on servers in the hopes that somebody unsuspecting is going to click on it. So PowerTech Antivirus is going to give you that protection. We've actually gone one step further, and we've enhanced the ransomware protection, because really what we've seen is that infected files on the system, they're bad. We're never good practice to have malware on your core server So what we've seen is a shift in the way the ransomware attacks are happening, where malware is they're not spreading or self-replicating that ransomware, but the files on the IFS were still being attacked and encrypted and held for ransom. So with our anti-ransomware protection technology, we're able to monitor that traffic going in and out of the file server. And when we see that malicious access pattern, we can block a user, stopping the attack. And that was one of those first screenshots I showed at the beginning of the presentation today, was that ability to block the attack, reduce the blast zone, protect the IBMI. That workstation still has a problem. You're still going to have to deal with that, but we've protected the core server. That's what you're going to get with the PowerTech Antivirus ransomware protection. We also bring to the table the third step in the ransomware protection strategies, and that's with our exit point manager, that transaction-based firewall where you've got the ability to see who's connecting to the system through these alternate interfaces and put some controls in place. Joe from accounting is allowed to use the IBMI. He has a green screen menu. He has a web interface he's supposed to use. But does he need to be able to FTP to the server? Probably not. Does he need to be able to access the file server? Yes. But even though Joe has all this authority, we want to narrow his access to the system through the file server. So you can use it to fine-tune those controls. The system itself, at the basic object level, you can only have one authority per user. And by actually taking that and using an exit program, you can apply different authorities based on the entry method of the system. So it gives you that full control and protection for the system. You can layer those two together. Exit point manager and PowerTech Antivirus and a ransomware, it layers together on the file server. So you're going to ensure that when that user hits the system, they're really authorized by exit point manager to use the file server. Then the anti-ransomware starts saying, all right, yeah, but what are you doing? Oh, wait a minute, your behavior looks suspicious. So really trying to ensure that you have the tools available to you to protect the system in the best way that you can. I always like customers to start with evaluating the current security posture on their system. And this is with our security scan. So Fortress PowerTech Security Scan looks at 6 areas of security on the system, provides you with a report breaking down each of those sections. We actually break it out into 7 sections, and gives you some actionable items, some things to think about. Think of this as your 30,000-foot view of security on the system. Good place to start to see really what is our exposure. Have we stepped back and looked at big picture what our security posture is on the IBMI? Or we have our heads down and not actually looking around to see what all of these potential exposures might be. So this one's cool because it's free. Everybody likes free. This is the source of that State of IBMI Security study I mentioned, the security scan. So these are non-intrusive. They are not going to change anything on your system. It collects that statistical information. Doesn't access any production data, doesn't make modifications to your settings. Just gives you that quick snapshot of what's happening. And we'll even do a review with you. So we'll actually spend an hour with you, talk through the results of the scan, talk about the risks, and why we flagged it as a risk. Because sometimes it's not just a, hey, this is terrible, you need to do something about it. It's better to understand why we're concerned about it and how this can be an impact. So really encourage customers to do that and use that information to get some traction and attention for the IBMI and actually have it included in those bigger security conversations. Really important that we do that. All right. I think, Janine, we're ready for some questions here. And I want to see there, I think I saw some questions come in. What do we have?
We do have some questions. And before we kick off, though, Sandi, I do think everyone's going to be interested in getting a copy of the deck, of the slides. So if you'd like to get a PDF of today's slide deck and join late, know that you can grab that right now go to Event Resources on the left side of your screen, click on that drop-down menu, select the slide deck, and know that you can download that right from the platform. And then another thing I want to mention is the link on this slide is actually a live link. So you can click on that right now, and it will open in a separate window and be available to you following the webinar, especially if you're interested in requesting that free security scan. You'll have that at your fingertips. And with that, let's get into the questions. So first question is, if I have a system that has net server turned off and no shares, am I still vulnerable?
It's a really good question. And I do get that a lot. And I think any system is still vulnerable. You've got Q shell, you've got FTP, you've got third-party applications that are being installed, you may have NFS mounts, and data may be coming from another server. You've got a development server, you've got a test server, you may have had to restore from your HA server. So that movement of files back and forth from the system still lends for an exposure. Absolutely is a reduced exposure because you've turned off the biggest threat to the system. But if you are hosting out files in any other way, through a web interface, a GUI interface, I talk to a lot of companies that have web servers running on their IBMI. It is their web server of record, and they're sharing out this data in these objects in the IFS. So it is still vulnerable, but you've definitely reduced the exposure. And I applaud you for getting rid of those shares and to not allow NetServer to be available. It does help, absolutely.
Great. Okay, Sandi, do you mind explaining root profiles from the slide? Someone says, sorry, I missed that part. Is it just all object authority?
Yeah, so yes, a root profile, and so we like to translate because people who are not familiar with IBMI, you tell them, oh, we have a bunch of SecOffer profiles or all object profiles. They go, oh, I don't know what that is. It's not important. And so we translate to a root profile. All object does not adjust. Just an all object authority is the authority to delete the entire system. And so all object authority is essentially God profile. You have the ability to change and access anything on the system. If you don't have the other special authorities, you have all object, you can give yourself the rest of the authority. So it is a very problematic profile, and it is very hard to contain. That root profile or that all object profile, making sure that you are able to control what they're able to do, and that's really where the exit programs can be extremely helpful, because an exit program is referred to before the user gets to the system. So that exit program can actually restrict somebody's authority and stop them from being able to delete things or encrypt things through that file server share and actually restrict that authority. So you may not be able to get rid of that all object on the profile, but you can ensure that it can't be used to attack the system. And that was my long answer. Always the long answer. Sorry, guys.
No, it was great. Okay, so I've never heard of a virus for AS400. Can you explain this? And then perhaps for people who haven't been around for years and years, clarify AS400.
Yeah, AS400 is, yeah. The original platform, well, actually, I think it's System 36 and 38. I know we got a lot of people that know that one as well. Yeah, so AS400, IBMI, I-Series, you know, the operating system names have changed over the years as the technology has evolved as well. AS400, so the native programs, of course, have to be recompiled. So native viruses are questionable. I will say that, you know, malware, by definition, is malicious software. So if you could write a malicious software program to run natively on IBMI, and technically that would be malware. But we're all really talking about that that Windows side, that those threats there. They're not going to run natively on IBMI, but it is the IFS that unfortunately plays that host and allows things to sit on the system.
How about this one? We changed all our file shares to read only. Isn't that good enough?
It definitely helps, and if you were to experience a ransomware attack and that user that had that read-only access to that read-only share will not be able to encrypt the files. However, if they read a file, it can be that part of that data exposure. So read-only is definitely going to reduce damage, but as I mentioned a couple times, there is more. It's a lot about the extortion of exposing information found, and most companies do have valuable information in their IFS and the integrated file system. Very often it's data that's been compiled into some sort of report or document that's stored in the IFS. So it is still an exposure, so you need to make sure that you are monitoring and controlling who has access to those shares and understanding what is being read. And reading is exposure. So it is still a concern, but you're going to have a little bit different type of impact in an attack.
Okay. Next question is, how does ransomware affect the native libraries?
Yeah. So when going back to those root shares, so having a root share over the system is going to include that qsys.lib infrastructure, which is the native programs, commands, libraries, all of that, those objects. In a ransomware attack, if that user has that read-write authority and they have that ability, the objects in the IBMI native side can be encrypted. If it's an object that can't be encrypted, say program, for example, those physical files can be encrypted, database files. The ransomware will very often delete an object if it can't encrypt it. So it can actually delete those native objects as well. So those native objects can be compromised. They aren't necessarily going to be infected. So it is, unfortunately, we have seen it happen. There's like didn't mention in the systems configuration side of it, there is an authorization list that can be implemented to restrict access to qsys.lib through shares, even with a root share, and that's the QPWF server authorization list, and you can set the public authority to exclude on that. Reach out to me, though, if you have any questions on that. You have to be careful when you start changing public authorities to exclude, especially if you're doing it in the wrong place. You can lock yourself out of your system. So I'd be happy to have a further conversation about that.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Seeing no more questions, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I also want to thank you, Sandi, for sharing your expertise with us today. Later this week, watch for a follow-up email. It will contain a link to the recording of today's webinar so you can watch it again or forward it to your colleagues in leadership to view on demand. Get all the latest on all things tech by going to techchannel.com/subscribe. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.